So let me go ahead and get started today. So for this week's lab, we are going to kind of be working on evolution and natural selection. So that's pretty much what we're going to be completing the rest of our semester with, in terms of looking at different organisms and different species and looking into see how they may be related to one another and if they're related to one another. Okay. All right, so is everyone able to see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Okay, so when we think about evolution, what comes to mind? Let's go ahead and make a list here. What do we think of when we think of evolution? Anybody? Okay, so Jackie says apes turning into men. Okay. Josie says survival of the fittest. Angel says Darwin. Okay. What else do we think of? Yes, Josie's answer probably a little bit more accurate, so we'll talk about that. Okay. Anything else we think of when we think of evolution? Anybody else? Let's see if we can get one more up here. We hear natural selection. Yeah, absolutely. So natural selection is going to play a role. Yeah, so all of these are different things that we think of when we think of evolution, right? So one of the things that we have probably heard of growing up is that, you know, when evolution takes place, it helps apes eventually become like our modern day human or our modern day man. We see survival of the fittest. You know, certain organisms are going to be able to survive better than others. The strongest ones will typically be the ones that are going to survive. Talk about that a little bit too. Darwin, who is kind of the major scientist who like really looked into evolution and saw how it takes place, and the theory of natural selection. Okay. So all these different things are probably what we've heard of evolution, and we've probably related to evolution in some form or fashion. Some of these are going to be true, and some of these are not going to be true, and some of them are going to have a little bit of a gray area. Now, one of those misconceptions is that a lot of times people think, when they think of evolution, apes eventually became men. And that theory has actually been debunked, but a lot of people don't really know it. So that got debunked a long time ago. Now, men and apes, we have a similar DNA sequences, but we also know that we are not, that we did not come from each other, that we're completely separate organisms. Survival of the fittest, that's also going to play a role. We'll talk about that in more detail in a second. We see Darwin, we see natural selection. So those are all going to be important concepts. So again, what I kind of think about, and one way that you can kind of think about evolution is that there's kind of a mainstream theory of evolution and then kind of a more biological theory of evolution. Okay? So the more mainstream, I kind of put that in quotes, theory of evolution has to do with, apes developing into man, or, certain organisms will eventually become other organisms or other species because they need to get better, or they need to get stronger, or they need to be whatever, right? That is not actually true. What we actually see though in when we look at evolution is what I consider the biological theory of evolution, or the biological definition. And so the biological definition of evolution is just a change in a population over time. Okay? That is how biologists will classify evolution. Okay? Any change in a population over a period of time. So this can be a change in the genetic sequences in that particular population. It could be, a change in size of that species. over a period of time. It could be a change in the fur color of that species over time. It could be a number of different things. As long as there's some kind of change happening in a population over a period of time. Okay. Now that being said, evolution is only going to be seen in populations. Okay. Individuals themselves are not going to evolve. Okay. So for example, from the time I'm born to the time I die, I might grow. Okay, but that growth is not evolution. That's just growth, right? That's just a process that normally happens. If we look at trees and how they go through different seasons, right, over the course of their own lifespan, that's not evolution. Those are just normal life processes. Okay? So individuals themselves are not going to evolve over their lifespan. Okay? But populations as a whole, okay, can evolve. Okay? And so typically, in order for us to see evolution, what has to happen is there's got to be a change in the genetic makeup of that population, or also called the gene pool within that population. Okay? So the amount of a particular gene, or the amount of different alleles in that particular population, and the different types of alleles and genes, is going to ultimately lead to evolution. Okay? Now, in order for us to see this change in the gene pool, okay, what typically has to happen is a change in the environment. Okay? So for example, if there's a change in the environment, okay, let's say, well, I'll give an example later. But let's say there's a change in the environment. Well, then the organisms and the species that have the necessary traits to survive in that environment are going to be the ones that end up surviving. The ones that don't are the ones that are going to die off. So you're going to lose entire genes because of that environmental change. Okay? So when you change the genetic makeup of that population, when some genes become more popular or more prevalent, okay, than other ones, then that's going to be where we see a change in the genetic makeup, and that ultimately was lead to a change in that population over time. Okay? So that is going to be what we consider evolution, okay? Change in that population over time. Okay? Now, in order for us to see evolution take place, what we need to see is variation in the traits that individuals in the population will have. Okay? So for example, if you take an entire population of, so let's say squirrels, for example, right? Some squirrels are going to be darker than others, some are going to be faster than others, some are going to be larger than others, right? There's going to be different variations in the traits over the course of, or throughout the course of that population. Okay? So certain traits are going to be more beneficial for survival in that particular environment at that time. Okay, other ones are not going to be as beneficial for survival. Okay? So that leads us into what's called natural selection. Okay? So natural selection is a phenomenon that works on individuals, okay? And that's going to be where we think of survival of the fittest. Okay? The strongest, whereas the way we kind of think about it is kind of the strongest organisms in that species or in that population will be the ones that survive. Okay. That's a little bit of a kind of an incomplete definition, but basically what natural selection is the individuals that have the necessary traits or adaptations to survive best in that environment are going to be the ones that are able to survive and then eventually reproduce and continue producing offspring with those same genes. Okay. The ones that do not have the traits necessary for them to survive and reproduce are going to be the ones that get removed from the population and eventually die. Okay. So natural selection is going to work on individuals, okay, over the course of their lifespan. And then when you take a bunch of natural selection, a bunch of events of natural selection occurring over a long period of time, that will lead us into what we consider evolution, or a change in the overall population over time. Okay. So Josie's question, so like the peppered moths from the beginning of the semester. Yes. So exactly like the peppered moths at the beginning of the semester. We'll talk about that next week when we get into lecture. So there's going to be certain traits, like you said, that are going to be more popular, more beneficial for survival. So if you remember at the beginning of this semester, we brought in the example of the peppered moths, where there were some that were kind of like salt and pepper colored, and then there were other ones that were darker colored. The ones that were salt and peppered were better for that initial environment because they were sitting on these lichen plants that were also kind of looking white and black, and so they were able to survive better because they were able to blend into their surroundings and not get picked off by the predators. But the black ones at the time were getting picked off by the predators because they were more easily seen. Okay? And then over time, that switched when the Industrial Revolution happened, and the darker moths became more prevalent because they were able to blend in with the ash-covered trees and everything, while the salt and pepper ones were the ones that were standing out and now getting seen by predators. Okay? So that is what we saw with natural selection occurring within those individual moths, but then over time, over the course of the initial population, and then over the course of the Industrial Revolution, that's where we saw evolution. That's where we saw a change in the population over time, and we saw them go from mostly white and black to mostly black. So that was evolution. That's going to be one of the things that we're going to be seeing here. So very good question, Josie. Okay, so I'm gonna give a quick example here. And so let's say we are looking at a couple rabbits. Let's say we're looking at a population of rabbits here. Let me move this out of the way. Okay. Let's say we have, let me try that again. Let's say we have a rabbit. Okay. Here's its head, here's its ears, okay. And then here's its tail, and then we got a couple legs. Okay, so we got some rabbits there. Let's say we got another rabbit here. And then again, some ears, and then some tails. Okay, so let's say for the sake of this example, we're looking at a special species of rabbits that we're gonna call Rabbitus gilroyus, okay. Gilroy rabbits, okay. So, and let's also say that in this population, let me say, so in this population, we have black rabbits. Okay. Give them a little smiley face. And we got black rabbits and we got white rabbits. Okay. I'll just put B and W for black rabbits and white rabbits in this population. Okay. So let's say all the black rabbits start mating with one another. They start producing black rabbit babies. Okay. So we got some black rabbit babies here. Okay. The white rabbits start reproducing with each other, and then we see some white rabbit babies. And then we also see that over time, the black rabbits and the white rabbits start coming into contact with each other. The black rabbits say, "Oh, white rabbit, you're kind of cute." And then the white rabbits say, "Ooh, black rabbit, you're kind of cute. Let's make some babies," right? So we're going to say they start making some babies here with one another. And now we're going to see offspring that are gray. Okay, I'll just put an X here just to signify that they're gray. Okay. So we have black rabbits, we have white rabbits, and then now we have gray rabbits as well. Okay. So that being said, has evolution taken place here? Okay. Did we see evolution occur? Yes or no? What do we think? So Excel says no. Okay. Does anyone agree with that? Anyone disagree with that? Jackie says no as well. Tim says no. Okay. Will, Angel says no. Okay. Turns out you guys are all wrong. So evolution has occurred here. So we initially first started off with a population that had just black rabbits and just white rabbits. Okay. However, in the next few generations, and now we start to see black rabbits, white rabbits, and gray rabbits. So our population has changed over some time. Okay. We went from having just black rabbits, white rabbits, to now having a combination of black rabbits, white rabbits, and gray rabbits. Okay. So here we do see that evolution has occurred. Remember, evolution is just some change in the population over time. Okay. Everyone following me so far? Does this make sense? So Jackie's question is, so evolution is about change and not survival? Yes, essentially. So evolution typically has to do with just changing. Now, in some cases, it can be due to survival and due to survival mechanisms, but it doesn't necessarily have to. Okay. It just has to do with just a change in the population. Okay. So Paul's question is, let's see, how come they aren't black and white, or might they be? So we'll just say, just for the sake of this example, we'll just say the colors blend. So instead of being, black and becoming black and white, or having black and white stripes, or spots or whatever, we're just going to consider them just being gray, just for the sake of this example. Okay, cool. All right, does this make sense? Start there. Yeah, okay. All right, cool. So that's that. So now, let's say that we go into the future, about 30 years, and let's say we now are in the year 2050, okay, where the average temperature is 115 degrees. Okay, the average daily temperature is 115 degrees, so it gets hot. Okay, so that being said, okay, the temperature has now increased dramatically. Okay, the black rabbits, because they're darker colored, they're going to attract more of that heat, and then they're going to start dying of heat stroke. Okay, so these guys are no longer in the population. We no longer see any black rabbits. And so instead, what we see are just our normal gray rabbits. Oops, let's try this again. Our normal gray rabbits here. Whoops, that's supposed to be its head. Okay. So our normal gray rabbits, and then we have our white rabbits. Okay. So we no longer have any black rabbits. Okay, so now looking at this situation here, okay, did evolution occur again? Yes or no? Yes, absolutely. So evolution now occurred because now our population has changed again, right? We initially had black rabbits, but then when the temperature got too hot, we ended up losing our black rabbits. They were no longer able to survive. So that would be where natural selection kind of comes into play. Okay. These black rabbits were no longer able to survive. The only ones that were able to survive are the gray rabbits and the white rabbits. So our population has changed. So evolution has occurred. Okay. Does that make sense? Cool. All right. So that's how evolution works. Again, evolution is just a change in the population over time. That's the biology definition of evolution. Cool. Okay. Any questions before we go forward here? Okay. So if there's no questions, so that's basically what evolution is. That's going to be what we're going to be leading into next week. Okay. So Jackie's question is, if there's more diversity or variety in the population, does that mean that environmental conditions are pretty favorable? It can. So it gets a little bit more complicated than that. So basically, her question is, if there's more diversity and more variety in the population, does that mean that the environmental conditions are favorable? In most cases, yes. That just means that the environment is suitable for many different types of organisms in that species, or there's lots of different types of variation that are able to survive in that environment. It could also be just a factor of the organisms themselves just being able to withstand those environmental conditions. So it can kind of go both ways here. It can be the environment being favorable, but it also could be the organisms themselves being able to actually survive in that environment, even if it may possibly be a harsher environment. So it depends, but in most cases, yes, that's what it means. Yeah. Okay, cool. All right, any other questions? Okay, cool. All right, so that is evolution. That's pretty much what we're going to be doing going forward for the next week. Okay. All right. So one way that we can kind of help to determine if evolution has occurred is by looking at these nice little resources called fossils. And so fossils are usually going to be the remains of species that have lived in the past. Sometimes they're usually going to be bones or more kind of harder structures that will end up becoming fossilized. And so what we can do is we can look at the fossils of past species and compare them to kind of the structure or the bones or the the overall build of today's current species, okay, or later species. Okay. And so as we compare the two, okay, we can be able to determine, okay, does this organism look like an organism from the past? And then we can use that to kind of help us determine if evolution has occurred between those two individual species. Okay. So in addition to doing that, one of the things that scientists will do is when they look for fossils, they're going to use what's called carbon dating or radioactive dating to help them determine how old that particular fossil is. Okay. And then based on the age of that fossil, they can kind of use that to help them determine how long ago that organism lived and if it could have been a species that evolved into one of today's current species. And then all that data that you acquire based on the age, based on the structure, and various other things, are going to get compiled into the fossil record. Okay. So an example of this is if we're looking at kind of today's modern day horse. Okay. So we all kind of know what a horse looks like. It's pretty large, it's got hooves, it's got a relatively large head. Okay. And so that's what a horse would typically look like. Okay. Now, when we're trying to determine if an organism evolved from something else, what scientists are going to do is they're going to look for what's called a transition fossil. Okay? And so a transition fossil is a fossil that kind of took an intermediate anatomy between one of today's current species, okay, or and kind of an earlier species or earlier fossils. Okay? So for example, kind of the first place where we saw the fossils of what could have been today's modern day horse was the Eohippus. Okay. And so the Eohippus existed about 55 to 45 million years ago. And it was pretty much about the size of a dog, so it wasn't terribly large. Instead of having hooves, it had paws. It was, again, smaller body. But the reason it lived like that is because, or looked like that, was because it typically lived in a more kind of forest-like environment. Okay. And so once scientists determined, or once they were able to find the Eohippus, okay, one of the things that they used to help confirm that the Eohippus eventually evolved into today's modern day horse was looking for transition fossils, okay, of species that were in between the Eohippus and the horse. Okay. And so the first one was the Mesohippus. That was the next species. And so the Mesohippus started to develop as the Eohippus started to move from environments that were more forest-like into environments that were more kind of field and more prairie-like. Okay. And because their food sources changed, okay, they also needed to have the appropriate type of teeth, the appropriate head size, in order to allow them to be able to take advantage of the resources that were available to them. Okay. So that's what we saw the Mesohippus about 40 to 30 million years ago. Okay. Then from there, we saw another one about 23 to 2 million years ago, which was the Hipparion. And so the Hipparion was in a more flatland-like environment. And so because the environment changed, again, that caused the organisms or the species that had actually hooves to be able to better survive and be able to take advantage of the resources. And so here we see the Hipparion developing hooves here instead of having paws like the earlier two species. And then again, they grew larger, their heads grew a lot larger in order to help them eat the appropriate foods. And then from there, the Hipparion eventually evolved into what we know as today's modern day horse. Okay. But again, in order to be able to know that the horse evolved from the Eohippus, is we need to look for transition fossils between the Eohippus, okay, and today's horse, which was the Mesohippus and the Hipparion. Cool. Okay, so that's going to be where fossils will come into play, how they're useful for helping us determine if certain species evolved from something else. Okay. All right, questions on fossils. Okay. All right, cool. Okay, so now moving forward. So fossils are going to be one way of determining if evolution occurred. Another way that we can determine if certain organisms may be related to one another, or if they had a common ancestor, or if they evolved from something else, is by looking at the anatomy of those particular organisms. Okay? So the first aspect of anatomy that we can look at is called comparative anatomy, where you compare the anatomy of multiple species. The first aspect of comparative anatomy that you can look at is called homologous structures. So homologous structures are structures that have the same overall form, okay, but those forms have different functions in different species. Okay? So for example, if we're looking at the arm bones of a human, dog, bird, and whale, okay, or kind of the limb bones, I should say, the appendages, the human is going to have a humerus bone, okay, the upper arm bone, And then the two forearm bones, which are the radius and the ulna. We're gonna have our wrist bones, and then the phalanges, which are our fingers. Okay. If we look at the dog, it's gonna have a similar function, okay, or similar form. It's gonna have kind of that first upper leg bone, okay, and then again, you have the two kind of foreleg bones, and kind of a wrist, and then the phalanges, which form the paws of the dog. Okay. If we look at a bird, similar thing. We got the first kind of smaller bone. It kind of forms a joint with two other bones. We have a kind of wrist bone, and then the phalanges here, okay, which help to make the wing. Okay. And then same thing with the whale. Okay, so the whale's got a one bone, two bones next to each other, okay, then kind of the wrist bones and the phalanges here. Okay. So again, we see that they have the overall similar form when we're looking at the appendages, the arms here. Okay. And so what that tells us is that there was likely a common ancestor, okay, between the human, the dog, the bird, and the whale. Okay. All these could have had a common ancestor. And so when that common ancestor eventually started to move off into different environments, okay, certain traits became more advantageous. Okay. And then they had to develop different functions and slightly different forms in order to survive in that environment. Okay. So for example, even though the human, dog, bird, and whale bones are all built similarly, they're all gonna have different functions because they all exist in different environments. Okay. So for example, the human, our arm bones are gonna allow us to be able to move and manipulate different things in our environments, grasp things, put things from one place to another, okay, using for moving objects. Okay. For the dog, the bones are going to be used mainly for walking, okay, from point A to point B. Okay. For birds, these bones are going to be useful for helping it fly. Okay. And then for whales, these bones are going to be useful for swimming. Okay. So they're all built similarly, but they have different functions. Okay. And again, each of those functions is going to be different because each of those organisms is going to occupy a different environment and a different kind of overall niche. Okay. So that's what we see with homologous structures. Okay. Another example is if we're looking at some insects, there might be a four-winged ancestor insect that had, obviously 4 wings. As it starts to move to different environments, okay, it's going to be exposed to different pressures. Okay. And so, for example, it might go to one environment and then eventually evolve into the common fruit fly, the Diptera. It might move to one environment and then become like a moth or a butterfly, or another one and then eventually evolve into a ladybug. Okay. All based on the different environments that it's been put into. Okay. So again, we initially started off with 4 wings, okay, but as it moves to different environments, the wings are going to overall remain the same structure, but there's going to be slight differences depending on the environment that it's been put in. Okay. So homologous structures, same basic form, okay, but different function. Okay. Any questions on homologous structures? Okay, so those are homologous structures. So then the next ones that we have are called vestigial traits. Okay. So vestigial traits are traits that occur in similar species, okay, but in one species, those traits have no function. Okay. So for example, we have an ostrich over here. Okay. So an ostrich is a type of bird. Okay. Most birds are going to have feathers, and those feathers will have wings to allow those birds to be able to fly. Okay. So birds typically have wings to help them fly. Okay. However, the ostrich also has wings, okay, but these wings do not allow the ostrich to fly. Okay. So these wings are basically useless. They have no function. Okay. However, they continue to exist, continue to persist from generation to generation, even though they don't have a function. And so that is what we consider a vestigial trait. Okay, something that persists, but does not have a specific function or does not have a particular function. Okay. So wings on flightless birds like the ostrich would be vestigial traits. Another example would be if we're looking at snakes. So snakes have pelvic bones, even though they don't have legs. Okay. And so the reason for that is possibly because there was a reptile ancestor that obviously had legs like frogs and lizards and things like that. A reptile ancestor that had legs, so it needed a pelvic bone. Okay. However, when the snake kind of developed, it lost its legs, but it maintains its pelvic bone, even though there's no function for it. Okay. So the pelvic bones in snakes have no function, so that would be considered a vestigial trait. Okay. It continues to exist in snakes across the board, okay, but they do not have any function. Okay. Another example would be the eyes on sightless cave animals. Okay, so for example, if you're looking at an animal that lives in like an underwater cave, which are going to be very, very deep in the ocean, it's going to be extremely dark. Okay? And so the eyes are typically not going to be working. Okay? Either the eyes themselves are just not able to see in the darkness where they exist, or the eyes themselves just don't work, period. Okay? So any cave animals that cannot see but still have eyes, okay, those would also be considered vestigial traits. Okay? Eyes on animals that cannot see. Okay? Continue to persist even though there's no function. So those are vestigial traits. Okay? Do vestigial traits make sense? Yeah, okay. All right, so that's that. Then the last type of anatomy that we can look at, the last type of structures, is what's called analogous structures. Okay? So analogous structures are evidence of what we consider to be convergent evolution. Okay? So what that means is that we have traits that develop differently, okay, traits that have a different overall function, sorry, a different overall structure, okay, but they serve the same function. Okay? Sorry, give me one second. So they're going to be traits that have a different structure, okay, but have similar function. Okay, so for example, here we're looking at an Arctic fox and we're looking at a ptarmigan bird. Okay, both of these are going to have white coverings, okay, but their white coverings are going to be different structured. One is going to have fur, the other one is going to have some feathers. Okay, but in either case, they're going to be white. Okay, so because they're built differently structurally, okay, they're not going to be evidence of common ancestry. Okay? They're not going to be evidence of things that evolved similarly or evolved from each other. Okay? Instead, what that tells us is that they evolved their particular traits because they share the same environment. Okay? And so, for example, the fox and the ptarmigan bird, okay, they both develop white coverings in order to help them escape from predators, okay, and help them to blend into the snow. Okay? So even though they're not related, okay, they develop similar traits because they exist in a particular environment in which that trait helps them to survive better. Okay? So that's going to be where we see natural selection begin to occur. So produce evolution here. Okay? So different traits, different structures, but perform the same function in terms of helping them to blend in and avoid predators. And so another example would be if we're looking at insects, humans have joints, insects also have joints, and so our joints are going to be built differently, but they all help to perform the same overall function in terms of helping us with locomotion, okay, and helping us to move. Okay. So they're not there as a result of common ancestry, but they developed because we needed a similar function. Okay. So analogous structures, different structure, okay, but the same function. In homologous structures, we have the same overall structure, but different functions. Okay. So that is analogous structures. All right, so that is that. Okay. Any questions on anything we've talked about so far? Okay. All righty, cool. So that is going to bring us to today's lab. So let me go ahead and pull this up here. All right, so you guys able to see the lab assignment? Okay. All right, cool. So for today's lab, we're gonna be looking at the anatomy. Yeah, this stuff is really interesting. This stuff is really cool. So we're going to be looking at the anatomy of 3 different organisms. Okay, so here we have the skeleton of a cat, we have the skeleton of a bird or a chicken here, and then we have a human skeleton. Okay, all of these bones are all labeled for you. Okay, so you can just look at the bones and compare their overall structures. Okay, so after you take a look at all these bones, what you're going to do for part 1 is you're going to look at the differences in the bones between the chicken, the cat, and the humans. Okay, look at how those bones are built similarly, but pay more attention to how they're different, how they're built a little bit differently. Okay, and think about why they may be built differently. Okay, why are the, like, for example, the leg bones, the femur, the tibia, and fibula, the tarsals, and why would the leg bones in a cat look different than the leg bones in a chicken? And why would that look different from the leg bones in a human? Okay. So try to figure out why their particular bones might look different from one another. Okay. So that's going to be where we're looking at homologous structures. Okay, overall same structure, okay, but they're going to have a different function. Okay. So as you start to think about that, think about kind of where that animal is going to be living, how it's going to get its food, any typical movement it's going to be making, what it's going to be doing on a day-to-day basis, and so on and so forth. Okay. So try to think about, and try to think a little bit critically about why their bones might look different, okay, and from one species to the next. Okay. So you're going to do that with the leg bones, you're going to do that with the pelvic bones, the upper limb bones, as well as the arm bones. Okay. So that's going to be part one. And again, you're just going to be looking at the anatomy of all these different bones here. That's it for that. Any questions on part one? Okay, cool. So the next part is part two. Okay. So in part two, we're going to be looking at vestigial structures. Okay. So we're going to be comparing one structure to another structure in another animal. Okay. So for example, here we have the human appendix, and then versus other animal or other mammals' appendix. Okay. So what you're going to do is you're going to look at the underlined one, okay, the underlined structure, and you're going to determine if it's a vestigial structure. Okay. Does it have any function in the underlined organism? Okay. So for example, the human appendix here, that's going to be the one that's underlined. So you're going to tell me if the human appendix is a vestigial structure or not. Same thing with the whale phalanges. Okay, you're going to tell me if that's a vestigial structure or not in comparison to the human phalanges, and then same thing with the human wisdom teeth, okay, versus other ones from the past. Okay. So that's going to be numbers 1 through 3. Okay, and then for number 4, you're going to come up with your own pair. Okay, so you're going to come up with your own pair of homologous structures, and one of them is going to be vestigial. Okay. Okay. And then explain why one of those is vestigial versus the other. So you're going to come up with your own example of vestigial traits here. Okay. That is part 2. Then part 3, here we've got 7 different structures here. We're looking at the lizard's forearm, the whales, the human, the penguin's kind of arm bones, the fish, the turtle, and the bird. Okay. You're going to look at all of these different bones here, and what you're going to do is you're going to identify one pair of homologous structures, and then explain why it's a homologous structure, and then one pair of analogous structures. And again, explain why we're looking at analogous structures, okay, based off of these 7 here. So all you need is one pair for each one. Okay, any questions on anything we're doing for activity 1? Okay, that's all you're going to be doing for activity 1. Any questions at all? Okay. All right, activity 2 we're going to do together. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to watch kind of the first kind of 5 or almost 6 minutes of this video here. And so this video is going to be on a couple of scientists named Peter and Rosemary Grant. Okay, and they're considered the kind of the major scientists who are really looking at evolution and natural selection and how it actually occurs today. Okay, so they're actually really cool. So what we're going to do is I'm going to put this link into the chat here, and I want you to watch from the beginning only until the 5:42 mark. Okay. So I'm going to have you guys watch this now, and then when you guys are done, we're going to come back. And when you're done, just say, write into the chat that you're done, or say back, or whatever, so that I know everyone's back. And then we can kind of talk about these 4 questions here. Okay. But again, you're only going to go into the 5-minute and 42-second mark. Cool. So go ahead and do that. In the meantime, go ahead and, if you haven't already muted your computers, mute it now. Watch this video up until the 5:42 mark. When you're done, come back and say done or back, and then we'll talk about these 4 questions here. Cool. All right, any questions with this before we go forward here? Okay, cool. All right, go ahead and watch the video, and then we will come back and talk about this as a group in about 6 minutes or so. we'll go ahead and wait a couple more, maybe a minute, one more minute, and see if everyone else comes back in here. All right, cool. Okay, so Jackie, just remember we're only going to the 542 mark. Okay, so it looks like everyone's just about finished with that first kind of 542. So cool. So we'll go ahead and come back and take a look at this. Take a look at our assignment here. So as you can see, Peter and Rosemary Grant, they are really involved with looking at how evolution actually occurs at the Galapagos Islands when they're looking at the Galapagos finches. Okay, so for that reason, these guys are kind of the heroes of evolutionary biology. They've been actually looking at it in real time in like modern day, and they've been looking at it for years, over like a very long period of time, about 40 years or so. And I'm not sure if they're still going, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're still going at this. But they're really important because they were actually able to show us that natural selection and evolution did actually occur. And they're able to show it in a very short periods of times. And so when we come back next week, we're going to really be looking at exactly how they were able to do that and how they were able to see natural selection actually occurring, right in front of their eyes. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and answer these questions here. So they're really cool people. They're like my heroes. And before we get started, are there any questions on kind of what they did and who they are and what they're involved in doing? Any questions? Okay, so if there's no questions, we'll go ahead and start answering some of these questions here. So the first question is, what do the different beaks tell us about the different finch species? Okay. So what do we think? Okay. What do the different beaks tell us? Right, so Jackie says each beak is basically a different tool, right? So what do we mean by a different tool? Okay, tool for what? For food, right. Each beak is a different tool for food. Okay. So each of the beaks is going to have is going to live in a specific environment, and each of those environments is only going to have a specific set of prey or food sources they can use. Okay. So there's going to be some beaks that are going to be larger, and that's going to help them to break down larger seeds. There are some that are going to be smaller, and that's going to allow them to be able to, take in and eat larvae. There's going to be some that are longer to help them kind of penetrate into trees, right? So each of the different beaks is going to help that particular finch species to be able to eat. Okay, that's going to be its food tool. Okay. Perfect. All right. So each beak is going to be a different tool for helping them to acquire food. Okay. So the second question says, what are the two hypotheses for how the Galapagos ended with so many different species of finches? Okay. So someone give me one hypothesis. What was one of the hypotheses for how there ended up being so many finch species? Okay. So Paul said one of them was that they evolved from one mainland finch, okay, through migration, like Freddie said. Okay. Okay. What was the other hypothesis? Anyone remember what the other hypothesis was? Anyone remember? Right. Paul said different species flew to each island, right? So there were already 13 different species, and the hypothesis was that all 13 of those species flew to each of the islands. Okay. So different species flew to each island. Okay, so those were the two species, or the two hypotheses for how the Galapagos Islands ended up with so many different finch species. So those are the two hypotheses. So question C asks us, what evidence did the scientists use to rule out one of the hypotheses? Okay, so how did they, actually, let's kind of backtrack. Which one of these hypotheses was actually the true one? Which one actually did occur? Was it hypothesis 1 or hypothesis 2? Right, 1. So there was one mainland finch, okay, and then it flew to each island, and each island ended up having different environments, which ultimately ended up with evolution of many different finches. Right. Okay. Right, and that's what, and Brianna's question, or Brianna kind of showed us that they all had more similarities to one another. Okay, they all had more similarities to one another than any of them did to the initial mainland finch. Right, perfect. Okay, so that being said, what was the evidence that the scientists used to rule out the hypotheses? Okay, so Brianna kind of hinted at it in that they were able to look at the similarities, but what specific tool did they use to help them rule out one of those hypotheses? Or rule out the second hypothesis, I should say. What did they use? Right, Jackie said they used DNA evidence, right? They used DNA testing in order to help them determine how closely related each of those species were. Okay? And through DNA testing, they were able to see, like Brianna had mentioned, that they're more similar to each other, okay, than they were to that initial mainland finch. Okay. Perfect. All right, good. And the last question, so why is the supported hypothesis important for understanding the effects of natural selection on these species? Okay. What do we think? Why is this hypothesis important for helping us understand natural selection as a whole? Anyone have an idea? So Brianna says because they evolved to best fit their environment, and that is absolutely true, right? They evolved to best fit their environment. And we'll look at this in more detail next week when we look at the rest of the video. But basically what happens is when each of the finches moves to that particular island, each island is going to have a different environment and different habitat, different food sources, different resources, different conditions. Okay? And so it has to have, each of the finches needs to be able to have the appropriate traits to help them survive in that environment. Okay? The ones that survive end up having those particular traits and continuing to pass those traits on to their offspring. Okay? The ones that don't have the traits to survive in that environment end up dying off, and then we never see those traits again. Okay? So that's evolve in order to best fit their environment. Okay. All right. Any questions on anything we've covered today? Or any other questions from this video? All right. So if there's no questions, again, all you need to do is do activity 1. Okay? So parts 1, 2, and 3. Complete this, turn it in by the end of the day, and then you guys will be good to go. Cool. All right. Any questions? If there's no questions, you guys are free to go, and then I will see you guys next week.